Welcome back to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing in our series on Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson with Chapter 7, The Curse of Machinery. As I've mentioned, we'll be doing this read as a parallel read with Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies. I'll put a link to that series in this video's description so you can check that out. Also, as I've mentioned in every video on this series so far, we will be doing an analysis and review after each read. So if you'd like to just jump straight to the analysis and review, I've put a timestamp to all of that in this video's description so you can check that out as well. Two more brief caveats before we dive in. One, this is a very long read. It will be from memory, it should be the longest read in Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. It'll be the longest read in the entire book. So you have to bear with me. That's part one. And number two, because of its length, Hazlitt broke this chapter up into 4 sections. And I'll let you know when those sections come in. He does not label the first section, so we open right off with that first section. So I'm going to go ahead and insert a part 1 after we read the chapter title because these sections are labeled just simply numerically. So without further ado, let's dive right on into Chapter 7, The Curse of Machinery, Part 1. Among the most viable of all economic delusions is the belief that machines on that balance create unemployment. Destroyed 1,000 times, it has risen 1,000 times out of its own ashes as hardy and vigorous as ever. Whenever there is a long-continued mass unemployment, machines get the blame anew. This fallacy is still the basis of many labor union practices. The public tolerates these practices because it either believes at bottom that the unions are right or is too confused to see just why they are wrong. The belief that machines cause unemployment, when held with any logical consistency, leads to preposterous conclusions. Not only must we be causing unemployment with every technological improvement we make today, but primitive man must have started causing it with the first efforts he made to save himself from needless toil and sweat. To go no further back, let us turn to Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. The first chapter of this remarkable book is called, quote, Divisions of Labor, end quote, and on the second page of the first chapter, the author tells us that a workman unacquainted with the use of machinery employed in pin-making, quote, could scarce make 1 pin a day, and certainly could not make 20, end quote. But with the use of this machinery, he can make 4,800 pins a day. So already, alas, in Adam Smith's time, machinery had thrown from 240 to 4,800 pin makers out of work for everyone it kept. In the pin-making industry, there was already, if machines merely throw men out of jobs, 99.98% unemployment. Could things be blacker? Things could be blacker, for the Industrial Revolution was just in its infancy. Let us look at some of the incidents and aspects of that revolution. Let us see, for example, what happened in the stocking industry. New stocking frames, as they were introduced, were destroyed by the handicraft workmen, over 1,000 in a single riot. Houses were burned, the investors were threatened and obliged to flee for their lives, and order was not finally restored until the military had been called out and the leading rioters had been either transported or hanged. Now, it is important to bear in mind that insofar as the rioters were thinking of their own immediate or even longer futures, their opposition to the machine was rational. For William Felkin, in his History of the Machine-Wrought Hosiery Manufacturers, 1867, tells us, though the statement seems implausible, that the larger part of the 50,000 English stocking knitters and their families did not fully emerge from the hunger and misery entailed by the introduction of the machine for the next 40 years. But insofar as the rioters believed, as most of them undoubtedly did, that the machine was permanently displacing men, they were mistaken. For before the end of the 19th century, the stocking industry was employing at least 100 men for every man it employed at the beginning of the century. Arkwright invented his cotton spinning machine in 1760. At that time, it was estimated that there were in England 5,200 spinners using spinning wheels and 2,700 weavers. In all, 7,900 persons engaged in the production of cotton textiles. The introduction of Arkwright's invention was opposed on the ground that it threatened the livelihood of the workers, and the opposition had to be put down by force. Yet in 1787, 27 years after the invention appeared, a parliamentary inquiry showed that the number of persons actually engaged in the spinning and weaving of cotton had risen from 7,900 to 320,000, an increase of 4,400%. If the reader will consult such a book as Recent Economic Changes by David A. Wells, published in 1889, you will find passages that, except for the dates and absolute amounts involved, might have been written by our technophobes of today. Let me quote a few. This is a very long quote, so you'll have to bear with me, folks. Quote, "During the 10 years from 1870 to 1880 inclusive, the British mercantile marine increased its movement in the matter of foreign entries and clearances alone to the extent of 22 million tons. Yet the number of men who were employed in effecting this great movement had decreased in 1880, as compared with 1870, to the extent of about 3,000, 2,990 exactly. What did it? The introduction of steam hoisting machines and grain elevators upon the wharves and docks, the employment of steam power, etc. In 1873, Bessemer steel in England, where its price had not been enhanced by productive duties, commanded $80 per ton. In 1886, it was profitably manufactured and sold in the same country for less than $20 per ton. Within the same time, the annual production capacity of a Bessemer converter has been increased fourfold, with no increase, but rather a diminution, of the involved labor. The power capacity already being exerted by the steam engines of the world in existence and working in the year 1887 has been estimated by the Bureau of Statistics at Berlin as equivalent to that of 200 million horses, representing approximately 1 billion men, or at least 3 times the working population of the earth." End quote. One would think that this last figure would have caused Mr. Wells to pause and wonder why there was any employment left in the world of 1889 at all, but he merely concluded with restrained pessimism that, quote, "Under such circumstances, industrial overproduction may become chronic." End quote. In the Depression of 1932, the game of blaming unemployment on the machines started all over again. Within a few months, the doctrines of a group calling themselves the technocrats had spread through the country like a forest fire. I shall not weary the reader with the recital of the fantastic figures put forward by this group, or with corrections to show what the real facts were. It is enough to say that the technocrats returned to the error in all its native purity that machines permanently displace men, except that, in their ignorance, they presented this error as a new and revolutionary discovery of their own. It was simply one more illustration of Santayana's aphorism that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. The technocrats were finally laughed out of existence, but their doctrine, which preceded them, lingers on. It is reflected in hundreds of make-work rules and featherbed practices by labor unions, and these rules and practices are tolerated and even approved because of the confusion on this point in the public mind. Testifying on behalf of the United States Department of Justice before the Temporary National Economic Committee, better known as the TNEC, in March 1941, Corwin Edwards cited innumerable examples of such practices. The electrical union in New York City was charged with refusal to install electrical equipment made outside of New York State unless the equipment was disassembled and reassembled at the job site. In Houston, Texas, master plumbers in the plumbing union agreed that piping prefabricated for installation would be installed by the union only if the thread were cut off one end of the new pipe and the new thread were cut at the job site. Various locals of the painters union imposed restrictions on the use of spray guns, restrictions in many cases designed merely to make work by requiring the slower process of applying paint with a brush. A local of the Teamsters Union required that every truck entering the New York metropolitan area have a local driver in addition to the driver already employed. In various cities, the electrical union required that if any temporary light or power was to be used on a construction job, there must be a full-time maintenance electrician who should not be permitted to do any electrical construction work. This rule, according to Mr. Edwards, quote, often involves the hiring of a man who spends his day reading or playing solitaire and does nothing except throw a switch at the beginning and end of the day, end quote. One could go on to cite such make-work practices in many other fields. In the railroad industry, the unions insist that firemen be employed on types of locomotives that do not need them. In the theaters, unions insist on the use of scene shifters, even in plays in which no scenery is used. The musicians' union required so-called standard musicians, or even whole orchestras, to be employed in many cases where only phonograph records were needed. By 1961, there was no sign that the fallacy had died. Not only union leaders, but government officials talk solemnly of quote-unquote automation as a major cause of unemployment. Automation was discussed as if it were something entirely new in the world. It was in fact merely a new name for continued technological advance and further progress in labor-saving equipment. Part 2. But the opposition to labor-saving machinery, even today, is not confined to economic illiterates. As late as 1970, a book appeared by a writer so highly regarded that he has since received the Nobel Prize in Economics. His book opposed the introduction of labor-saving machines in the underdeveloped countries on the ground that they, quote, decrease the demand for labor, end quote. The logical conclusion from this would be that the way to maximize jobs is to make all labor as inefficient and as unproductive as possible. It implies that the English Luddite rioters, who in the early 19th century destroyed stocking frames, steam power looms, and shearing machines, were after all doing the right thing. One might pile up mountains of figures to show how wrong were the technophobes of the past. But it would do no good unless we understood clearly why they were wrong. For statistic and history are useless in economics unless accompanied by a basic deductive understanding of the facts, which means, in this case, an understanding of why the past consequences of the introduction of machinery and other labor-saving devices had to occur. Otherwise, the technophobes will assert, as they do in fact assert when you point out to them that the prophecies of their predecessors turned out to be absurd, quote, that may have been all very well in the past, but today conditions are fundamentally different, and now we simply cannot afford to develop any more labor-saving machines, end quote. Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, indeed, in a syndicated newspaper column of September 19, 1945, wrote, quote, we have reached a point today where labor-saving devices are good only when they do not throw the worker out of his job, end quote. If it were indeed true that the introduction of labor-saving machinery is a cause of constantly mounting unemployment and misery, the logical conclusions to be drawn would be revolutionary, not only in the technical field, but for our whole concept of civilization. Not only should we have to regard all further technical process as a calamity, we should have to regard all past technical progress with equal horror. Every day each of us in his own activity is engaged in trying to reduce the effort it requires to accomplish a given result. Each of us is trying to save his own labor, to economize the means required to achieve his ends. Every employer, small as well as large, seeks constantly to gain his results more economically and efficiently, that is, by saving labor. Every intelligent workman tries to cut down the effort necessary to accomplish his assigned job. The most ambitious of us try tirelessly to increase the results we can achieve in a given number of hours. The technophobes, if they were logical and consistent, would have to dismiss all this progress and ingenuity as not only useless but vicious. Why should freight be carried from Chicago to New York by railroad when we could employ enormously more men, for example, to carry it all on their backs? Theories as false as this are never held with logical consistency, but they do great harm because they are held at all. Let us, therefore, try to see exactly what happens when technical improvements in labor-saving machinery are introduced. The details will vary in each instance, depending upon the particular conditions that prevail in a given industry or period. But we shall assume as an example that involves the main possibilities. Suppose a clothing manufacturer learns of a machine that will make men's and women's overcoats for half as much labor as previously. He installs the machines and drops half his labor force. This looks at first glance like a clear loss of employment, but the machine itself required labor to make it, so here, as one offset, are jobs that would not otherwise have existed. The manufacturer, however, would have adopted the machine only if it had either made better suits for half as much labor or had made the same kind of suits at a smaller cost. If we assume the latter, we cannot assume that the amount of labor to make the machines was as great in terms of payrolls as the amount of labor that the clothing manufacturer hopes to save in the long run by adopting the machine. Otherwise, there would have been no economy, and he would not have adopted it. So there is still a net loss of employment to be accounted for. But we should at least keep in mind the real possibility that even the first effect of the introduction of labor-saving machinery may be to increase employment on net balance, because it is usually only in the long run that the clothing manufacturer expects to save money by adopting the machine. It may take several years for the machine to, quote-unquote, pay for itself. After the machine has produced economy sufficient to offset its cost, the clothing manufacturer has more profits than before. We shall assume that he merely sells his coats for the same price as his competitors and makes no efforts to undersell them. At this point, it may seem labor has suffered a net loss of employment, while it is only the manufacturer, the capitalist, who has gained. But it is precisely out of these extra profits that the subsequent social gains must come. The manufacturer must use these extra profits in at least one of three ways, and possibly he will use part of them in all three. 1. He will use the extra profits to expand his operations by buying more machines to make more coats. Or 2, he will invest the extra profits in some other industry. Or 3, he will spend the extra profits on increasing his own consumption. Whichever of these three courses he takes, he will increase employment. In other words, the manufacturer, as a result of his economies, has profits that he did not have before. Every dollar of the amount he has saved in direct wages to former coat makers, he now has to pay out in indirect wages to the makers of the new machine, or to the workers in other capital-using industry, or to the makers of a new house or car for himself, or for jewelry and furs for his wife. In any case, unless he is a pointless hoarder, he gives indirectly as many jobs as he ceased to give directly. But the matter does not and cannot rest at this stage. If this enterprising manufacturer effects great economies as compared with his competitors, either he will begin to expand his operations at their expense, or they will start buying the machines too. Again, more work will be given to the makers of the machines, but competition in production will then also begin to force down the price of overcoats. There will no longer be as great profits for those who adapt the new machines. The rate of profit of the manufacturers using the new machines will begin to drop, while the manufacturers who have still not adopted the machine may now make no profit at all. The savings, in other words, will begin to be passed along to the buyers of overcoats, to the consumers. But as overcoats are now cheaper, more people will buy them. This means that, though it takes fewer people to make the same number of overcoats as before, more overcoats are now being made than before. If the demand for overcoats is what economists call elastic, that is, if a fall in the price of overcoats causes a larger total amount of money to be spent on overcoats than previously, then more people may be employed in even making overcoats than before the new labor-saving machine was introduced. We have already seen how this actually happened historically with stockings and other textiles. But the new employment does not depend on the elasticity of demand for the particular product involved. Suppose that, though the price of overcoats was almost cut in half from a former price of, say, $150 to a new price of $100, not a single additional coat was sold. The result would be that while consumers were as well provided with new overcoats as before, each buyer would now have $50 left over that he would not have had left over before. He will therefore spend this $50 for something else, and so provide increased employment in other lines. In brief, on net balance, machines, technological improvements, automation, economies, and efficiency do not throw men out of work. Part 3. Not all inventions and discoveries, of course, are quote-unquote labor-saving machines. Some of them, like precision instruments, like nylon, lucite plywood, and plastics of all kinds, simply improve the quality of products. Others, like the telephone or the airplane, perform operations that direct human labor could not perform at all. Still others bring into existence objects and services such as X-ray machines, radios, TV sets, air conditioners, and computers that would otherwise not even exist. But in the foregoing illustration, we have taken precisely the kind of machine that has been the special object of modern technophobia. It is possible, of course, to push too far the argument that machines do not on net balance throw men out of work. It is sometimes argued, for example, that machines create more jobs than would otherwise have existed. Under certain conditions, this may be true. They can certainly create enormously more jobs in particular trades. The 18th century figures for the textile industries are a case in point. Their modern counterparts are certainly no less striking. In 1910, 140,000 persons were employed in the United States in the newly created automobile industry. In 1920, as the product was improved and its cost reduced, the industry employed 250,000. In 1930, as this product improvement and cost reduction continued, employment in the industry was 380,000. In 1973, it had risen to 941,000. By 1973, 514,000 people were employed in making aircraft and aircraft parts, and 393,000 were engaged in making electronic components. So it has been in one newly created trade after another, as the invention was improved and the cost reduced. There is also an absolute sense in which machines may be said to have enormously increased the number of jobs. The population of the world today is 4 times as great as in the middle of the 18th century before the Industrial Revolution had got well underway. Machines may be said to have given birth to this increased population, for without the machines, the world would not have been able to support it. 3 out of every 4 of us, therefore, may be said to owe not only our jobs, but our very lives to machines. Yet it is a misconception to think of the function or result of machines as primarily one of creating jobs. The result of the machine is to increase production, to raise the standard of living, to increase economic welfare. It is no trick to employ everybody, or even, or especially, in the most primitive economy. Full employment, very full employment, long, weary, back-breaking employment is characteristic of precisely the nations that are most retarded industrially. Where full employment already exists, new machines, inventions, and discoveries cannot, until there has been time for an increase in population, bring more employment. They are likely to bring more unemployment, but this time I am speaking of voluntary and not involuntary unemployment, because people can now afford to work fewer hours, while children and the overaged no longer need to work. What machines do, to repeat, is to bring an increase in production and an increase in the standard of living. They may do this in either of 2 ways. They do it by making goods cheaper for consumers, as in our illustration of the overcoats, or they do it by increasing wages because they increase the productivity of the workers. In other words, they either increase money wages or, by reducing prices, they increase the goods and services that the same money wages will buy. Sometimes they do both. What actually happens will depend in large part upon the monetary policy pursued in a country. But in any case, machines, inventions, and discoveries increase real wages. Part 4. A warning is necessary before we leave the subject. It was precisely the great merit of the classical economists that they looked for secondary consequences, that they were concerned with the effects of a given economic policy or development in the long run and on the whole community. But it was also their defect that, in taking the long view and the broad view, they sometimes neglected to take also the short view and the narrow view. They were too often inclined to minimize or to forget altogether the immediate effects of developments on special groups. We have seen, for example, that many of the English stocking knitters suffered real tragedies as a result of the introduction of the new stocking frames, one of the earliest inventions of the Industrial Revolution. But such facts and their modern counterparts have led some writers to the opposite extreme of looking only at the immediate effects on certain groups. Joe Smith is thrown out of a job by the introduction of some new machine. Quote, "Keep your eye on Joe Smith," end quote, these writers insist. Quote, "Never lose track of Joe Smith," end quote. But what they then proceed to do is to keep their eyes only on Joe Smith and to forget Tom Jones, who has just got a new job in making the new machine, and Ted Brown, who has just got a new job operating one, and Daisy Miller, who can now buy a coat for half what it used to cost her. And because they think only of Joe Smith, they end by advocating reactionary and nonsensical policies. Yes, we should keep at least one eye on Joe Smith. He has been thrown out of a job by the new machine. Perhaps he can soon get another job, even a better one. But perhaps also he has devoted many years of his life to acquiring and improving a special skill for which the market no longer has any use. He has lost this investment in himself, in his old skill, just as his former employer, perhaps, has lost his investment in old machines or processes suddenly rendered obsolete. He was a skilled workman and paid as a skilled workman. Now he has become overnight an unskilled workman again and can hope, for the present, only for the wages of an unskilled workman, because the one skill he had is no longer needed. We cannot and must not forget Joe Smith. He is one of the personal tragedies that, as we shall see, are incident to nearly all industrial and economic progress. To ask precisely what course we should follow with Joe Smith, whether we should let him make his own adjustment, give him separation pay or unemployment compensation, put him on relief, or train him at government expense for a new job, would carry us beyond the point that we are here trying to illustrate. The central lesson is that we should try to see all the main consequences of any economic policy or development, the immediate effects on special groups, and the long-run effects on all groups. If we have devoted considerable space to this issue, it is because our conclusions regarding the effects of new machinery, inventions, and discoveries on employment, production, and welfare are crucial. If we are wrong about these, there are few things in economics about which we are likely to be right. All right, that concludes tonight's read. On now to the analysis and review part of this video. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So there's kind of a lot to get into, and this is already a very long read. So I'm going to try to be as concise as I can, but you'll have to bear with me. This read overall might be a fairly long one. So first things first, let's start, because this was a long read and it might have gotten lost. The main fallacy that he's here to refute in this chapter is that improvements in technologies, especially machinery, cause increased unemployment. This is not true, and it's an empirical claim that he makes, and that it's not only an empirical claim. It's a principled claim as well. So he disproves the claim empirically, and he does that with in the same manner that Adam Smith does in The Wealth of Nations, and even cites The Wealth of Nations and its content very specifically. So he smatters the empirical side of the discussion throughout the course of the chapter. I will put a link in this video's description to my read of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, so you can go ahead and check that out if you're interested. So he goes into the empirical side of things, which should be fairly self-explanatory. But what's more important is why it's not true. So it's not as important that it's not true which is what the empirical side of things evidence is. It's much more important that we have what's called proof. And I talked about the difference between proof and evidence in a previous discussion, in a previous review I did in a read on Thomas Sowell's Economics and Facts and Fallacies. So I will link to that in this video's description as well. So you guys should check that out. So what we're going to get onto now is the principled side of things. So the question of does technology cause increased unemployment is no, but further, why not? So the first, the most obvious reason this is the case is that with the introduction of new machines, you need new labor to produce the machines and to operate the new machines. So it may be a different skill set than what those machines basically replaced. So that's the first area that he explains. In pretty obvious manner. I should actually let me go back real quick just on one topic. This is so when I talk about the difference between the proof versus evidence, I'm talking about the difference between induction and deduction, and Hazlitt mentions this in brief on page 54. For statistics and history are useless in economics unless accompanied by a basic deductive understanding of the facts, which means in this case an understanding of why the past consequences of the introduction of machinery and other labor-saving devices had to occur. So that's what he means when he says that. So first things first, of course, the most obvious reason why is that with the introduction of new machines comes the introduction of new labor to both manufacture and to operate the new machines. That's the one that's most obvious. Usually this discussion stops there, but the whole point of this book is to go beyond what is facially obvious and to go into further arenas. In this case, the next thing that he brings up, and this is the major lesson, is that the machines would never exist unless the machines created a competitive advantage in the market. So Hazlitt doesn't actually mention the phrase competitive advantage. It should be a self-evidentiary. It should be its definition should be self-evident. It is an advantage that it is an advantage that manifests itself in a competitive market. So the first thing to mention here is that if there were no competitive advantage to the introduction of these new machines, not only would the new machines not be manufactured, they wouldn't be purchased. So what that means is that in the case of the labor, let's say we're talking about the tailor, that in the case of the labor for the tailor, he would rather have the machine than the employment. He would rather have the machine make the thing than the human being make the thing. And the important thing to note here is that with the competitive advantage that the machine creates, there is an obvious benefit that needs to be gained, not just by the manufacturer, and not just by the clothier in this case, or the tailor that I think that Hazlitt keeps referring to. But it must result in something that gains him a material advantage in the market, which means that it's something that must, in the case of the tailor, either decrease his costs significantly, or must produce a better product, or must in some way produce a product that he can get much more of in terms of end delivery to the consumer. Which means in the most obvious case, if it's producing a cheaper product, then obviously more of these machines will need to be built, which means you need more people making the machines and you need more people operating the machines. And because there's a competitive advantage, what that means is that either he will employ it or someone else will, because his competitors are looking to gain an advantage, a material advantage. And one advantage would be that if they can afford to then sell their coats at a much reduced price, they're going to eat up all of the market share, right? All of the consumers are going to go to that other tailor. So he now has to employ those machines. What that means then, of course, is that everybody is going to either have to start employing these machines or they're going to go out of business. which means that you're going to see a lot of these machines get created. So it's not just going to, so the other thing is that it's not just going to replace the number of coats that were created in the first place, because if you now lower the price significantly, the entry barriers into this market for the consumer are reduced significantly, which means that more people are going to be buying coats. And it may be just a case of, let's say, how many t-shirts, guys out there, how many t-shirts do you own? Is it more than one? Yeah, it's probably a lot more than one. Why is that? Well, it's because you can afford a lot more than one. If t-shirts were $1,000 a piece, you'd own at most one. But since t-shirts can be had very often for free, but sometimes for less than $20, most guys, at least, have a ton of t-shirts. And girls, I'm sure if you've ever had to do laundry or try to deal with his dresser drawers, you probably understand what I'm talking about here. The thing that gets missed, and this is the main lesson, of course, is that the people who are making these claims that the unemployment, that these new machines create unemployment, this technological advancement creates employment, is not the big lesson is that you have to look beyond just the worker who has lost his job in the moment doing that one specific thing. Because the other thing to take into account here is that all of those machine operators, because of the competitive advantage, are axiomatically going to be so the first place to look is at these workers are axiomatically going to be making more money. And the reason that's the case is because as Smith pointed out, and it's part of Smith's lesson, if one guy can make hundreds or thousands of times more of a product in a day than the other guy, you're going to be able to pay that guy. It makes sense to pay that guy a heck of a lot more money. And that's, of course, what that pay rate is. That's, of course, what that new skill set is going to command. So this is true both in relative terms, and it's, of course, it's axiomatically true. Otherwise, you wouldn't see the competitive advantage. The competitive advantage is the fact that they can create a lot more of these in a day, which means that you can turn out a significantly more product for a significantly lower price for a lot of reasons, which should be fairly obvious. And therefore, the pay rate is increased both in the absolute and relative terms, which means that in the course of a day, let's say, his pay rate is increased. And of course, his pay rate is increased by... so that would be the absolute number. And of course, the relative pay rate increases too, because now those things are cheaper in the market. All of these things that we can make with machines are now cheaper in the marketplace. So that dollar amount that they're getting not only is a greater amount in absolute terms, but it can buy more things because all of those products on the market are now cheaper as a whole. Not just that product, but if we carry out the machine, and the technological advancement throughout the course of the entire economy, everything becomes significantly cheaper. So that money tends to go a lot further. And like I said, this will naturally segue to the lesson, which is explained, and I'll try to get through this paragraph as fast as I can. On page 55, this is what Hazlitt means when he says, "This looks at first glance like a clear loss of employment, but the machine itself required labor to make it, so here, as one offset, are jobs that would not otherwise have existed. The manufacturer, however, would have adopted the machine only if it had either made better suits for half as much labor or had made the same kind of suits at a smaller cost. If we assume the latter, we cannot assume that the amount of labor to make the machines was as great in terms of payrolls as the amount of labor that the clothing manufacturer hopes to save in the long run by adopting the machine. Otherwise, there would have been no economy, and he would not have adopted it." So in the case of the clother, in the case of the tailor and the manufacturer, the tailor, of course, is now has more money to spend. And the next obvious question is with the capitalist, if you will, the manufacturer making more money, and with the tailor making more money, and with the consumer spending able to buy things they otherwise wouldn't have been able to buy. And if they don't wind up buying those things that they wouldn't have bought, saving money on the things they already are buying. What are all these people going to do with that new money? He explains this on page 56. So if you just bear with me, this is another decently wrong segment. This starts on page 55 and continues into page 56. The manufacturer must use these extra profits in at least one of three ways, and possibly he will use part of them in all three. One, he will use the extra profits to expand his operations by buying more machines to make more coats. Or two, he will invest the extra profits in some other industry. Or three, he will spend the extra profits in increasing his own consumption. Whichever these three courses he takes, he will increase employment. Let me explain how that's the case. So in option one, he will use the extra profits to expand his operations. So that means that he's investing in his own company, which means he's creating unemployment already, axiomatically, that wasn't there to begin with. So this is why when Hazlitt talks about how in certain industries, the machines actually significantly increase the absolute and relative employment in those industries. Two, he will invest the extra profits in some other industry. So this would be like if he puts it into a bank or to a mutual fund or invests it in stock. Obviously, he's giving these people other money. In the case of a bank, if he just pumps it into a bank, the bank will now have a lot more money, an increase in supply, a surplus in supply, if you will, to lend out, which means that, of course, what happens when you have a surplus of supply, price goes down, which means that it'll be easier then for people to not only get loans and afford loans, it will make taking on the risk of a loan much cheaper, because if you can reduce the interest rate from, say, 5% to 4% to 3% to 2%, now it makes more sense to take on these risks. Now it makes more sense to get these loans. And what do people do when they get these loans? Did they just sit on that money and pile it up under their bed? No, they have to do something that is not only going to pay back the loan, but make them money. And the only way that happens is if you have a lot of voluntary transactions. And the only way basically that's going to happen is if there is some sort of new employment created from that. So in the case of investment in companies, obviously they have a built-in incentive, a colossal built-in incentive to increase productivity, to take risks like opening up new locations. This means new employment every single time. And then the third place that they said is he will spend extra profits on increasing his own consumption. He'll buy a yacht. And if he buys a yacht, somebody's got to make that yacht. Somebody's got to deliver that yacht. Somebody's got to maintain that yacht. Right? So in the case of a yacht, in the case of increasing his own consumption, there are new jobs created, because if he wasn't going to buy the yacht, then all those people involved in making that yacht don't have jobs. So maybe he buys more houses. Maybe he buys a bigger house. Maybe he starts investing in property. All of these construction workers now have more work. And even if there aren't more construction workers to actually go into these industries, what happens when you increase demand? What happens when demand increases to a level that it exceeds supply? That means you have a shortage of labor. Prices increase. So what does that mean? Those people that were already working in those industries now make more money. And not only are they making more money, like I said, things become cheaper. So everybody wins in the long run. And the other thing that gets forgotten, and of course, the exception to this is if there is a fourth option, which is incredibly dumb and straight up nobody does this. And that's if the money, as he explains, hoards it. In any case, unless he is a pointless hoarder, he gives indirectly as many jobs as he ceased to give directly. So there's one fourth option, and that's if he's Scrooge McDuck and has some sort of Scrooge McDuckian money bin that he literally piles cash up in, which is the stupidest thing in the world, and nobody who has any money actually does this. Now, Jeff Bezos doesn't take wads of $100 bills and uses it to line his mattress in perpetuity. It's the stupidest possible investment you could possibly make. Literally anything will tend to make over time more money than just piling it up under your bed. That basically might as well be setting money on fire. So that's the only way that new investment and increased revenue doesn't necessarily create more jobs. Yeah, I guess Scrooge McDuck had to pay somebody to make that money bin he swims in. So I guess that would technically make more jobs from that direction, but that would be him spending his own consumption for the bin itself. The other thing that can get forgotten in all of this is the consumer. In the case of the consumer, they get, in this case, What are they going to do with that money? And it's basically the same thing. So either they're going to consume more and live more luxuriously because everything is cheaper, or they're going to save that money, invest that money in their retirement. And it means that because things are so much cheaper and they're making more money, and that investment is earning more money, because the more you invest as these technologies are allowed to manifest, as growth tends to incur, the better returns you're going to have on your investment. What that means is kind of more early retirement, and as you retire, your investments not only being larger in the principal, but also having greater returns on the investment. It means that you can live longer. And as Hazlitt explained, one of the knock-on effects of all of this technological advancement is that there are more people to begin with. And he'll explain this in later chapters, but I'm sure you've heard the fallacy that the industrial revolution and the free markets put kids in dangerous factories. Where were those kids before that? Where did we put those kids before that? We put them 6 feet under. Those kids died. The reason those kids were working is because before that, they were simply dead. They were simply dead because life sucked. And suddenly we had this industrial revolution that allowed children to get through infancy. And what were they to do? Well, there was work to be had, so there was work that was done. So it created the option for them to go work in those factories. Yes, children cannot consent because they're children, so it is okay to have rules against them working in those type of dangerous situations because they cannot technically consent to that danger and that risk, right? So that would be why you don't have children in the workplace from a free market perspective. But the other thing, like I said, is that it creates, because those people can retire earlier, it creates voluntary unemployment, which is a good thing. There are things that people don't have to do. For example, I don't have to work a field for 9 months and pray for rain and sunshine for me to survive through the winter. I don't have to do that. I have heat in my office. I have heat in my home. I have air conditioning in my home, so I don't have to suffer through the summer. So in this case, everybody wins. So he does mention briefly some exceptions to all of this, and that one real exception is those exceptions that are dependent upon government policy. So the types of cases where machinery is replacing labor in what I would consider not a free market. So he mentions this in passing. He mentions this on page 59. What actually happens will depend in large part on the monetary policy pursued in a country. So in the case of minimum wage, for example, if you have a very high minimum wage, what that means is you have a very high barriers to entry into the market in the first place. This is really important for teenagers because, and people who are first entering the workforce, because they don't have any skills, they don't have any working history, they don't have any proof or reference or even frame of reference for their own work ethic. So if you have a very low barrier to entry, then those people who don't have these skills, which may include the handicapped, the physically and mentally handicapped, they wind up getting replaced by machines. And as we learned from Smith's lesson, if there were no minimum wage in that case, and the employer would rather have the labor than the machine, then obviously in this case, not only do we not have a free market example, obviously the employer would rather have the labor than the machine. So in this case, this is not a voluntary exchange. And this is a reflection of government policy rather than of market influences. So in this case, if you want to increase employment, one of the things you can do is lower barriers to entry into the market in the first place, into the labor market in the first place. One of those barriers could well be a minimum wage. I believe I talked about that in my series on interference, so I'll link to that in this video's description as well. Excuse me, it's been a long read tonight, so you have to excuse me while I take a sip of water here. The other exception you guys are going to hear is the Star Trek example. And I'm going to use Next Generation because that's where the technology kind of peaked. And first things first, the world that Gene Roddenberry envisioned of Star Trek: The Next Generation, not the original series, but we're talking mainly about Next Generation here, isn't really communism or socialism. It's kind of more of it's kind of more of a libertarian wet dream, if you will, taken to a hyperbolic extreme. It's kind of the most optimistic take on a free market and libertarian society. So this is, in the case of Star Trek: The Next Generation, we're not talking about a society in which government owns all property or even has collectivized through the government the means of production. So this isn't communism, this isn't socialism, this is still a free market. Quark on Deep Space Nine, which is happening simultaneously in terms of chronology with Next Generation, has his own bar, his own gambling parlor, and they exchange latinum. So this is a society where you will never find a society where a medium of exchange ceases permanently to exist in perpetuity. But in this case, there isn't. You've got a society that has advanced technologically beyond scarcity. So we talked about scarcity pretty much ad nauseum at this point. But in this case, when there is no scarcity, there's no need to work. You do the things you want to do, because in the case of Star Trek: The Next Generation, everything is available at an instant and at essentially no cost, right? I mean, you have transporters that can get you from one end of the planet to the other in an instant, and apparently at no cost and at no risk of life. So you don't need any other forms of transportation. You have much faster than light travel, which allows you to explore the farthest reaches of the galaxy in a matter of minutes, hours, or at most days. Which means that even if we completely overpopulate the Earth, we can expand out ad infinitum throughout all the corners of the galaxy. And we can do it in mass because apparently these ships can carry like thousands and thousands of people, again, at extremely low risk and basically no cost. We have fusion generator sources, portable fusion generator sources, I think in Star Trek to the size of briefcases. They may be a little bit smaller than that allow you to bring powerhouses anywhere at an instant with a near infinite supply in the moment and in perpetuity of electrical power and of heat. And of energy in general. You have the antimatter-matter reaction and the reactor core in Star Trek, and we're using Star Trek antimatter, not actual antimatter, to create a reaction that is, although dangerous, basically creates an infinite supply of energy, basically. On top of all of that, for all of these things that you would want to have, we have replicators that can, in an instant, take nothing and make whatever you verbally command the replicator to make, and at essentially no cost. There's some technologies that we actually have today that when Next Generation came out was utter fantasy. For example, if you wanted to communicate, in a viewing screen, we have that. It's called Zoom. It's called everything on the internet with a computer. If you wanted to have a device that could tell you in an instant, everything you could possibly ever imagine wanting to know. We have that in our pockets every day. We now even have the Go-Go Gadget watch that allows you to communicate with people through the watch. We have earbuds that are the size of insertable hearing aids that you can put into your ears and tap and talk to somebody over the phone. We now even have talk to type, so we can talk into all of these devices and communicate via text by just talking to the device. We now have translators that can translate from one language to the other in an instant. Even when it comes, we don't have the medicine of Next Generation, but that was another consideration to be made. Imagine being able to heal anything, all of man's natural ills, in an instant, and apparently at no cost. Imagine having a scanning device that can review an entire room and tell you everything that's in it. One of the devices from Star Trek that we have now is Star Trek's onboard computer. Hey, Alexa, how tall is Mount Everest? Boom! Mount Everest is 29,000 however many feet. So in that society, people did the things that they wanted to do. There was no need to exchange currency. There was no need to have a medium of exchange. Eventually, there would be one that would persist throughout parts of the galaxy, but for the most part on Earth, everything was available at no cost at an instant. So what did you really even need the money for? Why do you need to work? What would you do if you had an infinite supply of resources available at your fingertips? So that of course would be if Bill Gates wrote you a $2 billion check, what would you do with your life? In my case, the thing I would be doing for free would be coaching youth soccer. I would be volunteering to do that because that's a job I would do for free. Even the best job I ever had, I would never do for free. And I had one hell of a damn good job. And maybe we'll get into that another time. So in the case of what's happening in Star Trek, if we break that down into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as people get wealthier, they tend to spend more time in the higher ends of that hierarchy. And we've known this for a long time. It's a well-proven fact of humanity and human behavior that, when you're just focused on subsistence, when you're poor as hell and you've got to eat, it's $16.95 and feeding the kids is all we care about, you're not going to spend a whole lot of time working on self-actualization. You may not even spend a whole lot of time socializing. And you may not spend as much time caring about your safety because I'll do something dangerous, right? The guys I used to work with from Guatemala were happy to climb up on incredibly steep roofs with no ropes and no spikes and hang Christmas lights because they needed the money, because they needed to eat. They were on those lower rungs of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But as you tend to get wealthier, as technological advancement tends to do, is making a society wealthier, right? We are wealthier now than obviously we were 300 years ago when nobody made it through infancy and everyone was dead at 35. Medicine sucked and every job that was out there was brutal and meant working 7 days a week from way before sunrise to way after sunset, and living in a hut with, 17 other people in the same room. And no insulation, no indoor plumbing, no heat, no air conditioning, no electricity. Yeah. So as you tend to get richer, you tend to spend more time in those higher ends of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So in the case of Star Trek, if we don't have any employment and everyone's just working on making themselves better, doing those things that they would do for free, if we're all spending that time and in that highest point in that self-actualization, that's great. That's actually a damn good thing. Now, there is a further question to be had about what people will do with themselves when they don't have a job, when they don't have a thing that they have to do, when they don't have people who are specifically depending on them for a thing. That's a psychosocial issue that is probably going to be a problem in that society, especially among men who can tend to get very violent under those circumstances when they have nothing to easily create fulfillment within themselves, like a job tends to do with most guys. But that's an entirely different conversation to be had. And it's not the point that Hazlitt is actually trying to discuss here. So the last thing that he talks about is what I'll call the forgotten man, the man that does, in a certain instance, lose that job, at least in the short run. Hazlitt tends to kind of breeze over this guy. I wish he had talked more about them. And I think that's because way back when he wrote this, there wasn't a whole lot of knowledge as to, from a free market perspective, what you would do in that circumstance for that guy. Now, I have sympathy for that guy because it sucks getting fired. It sucks losing your job to a technological advancement. And this is going to happen. And there are going to be people out there who are going to have a very hard time finding new employment because in many cases, perhaps the advancement, and perhaps you were really good at one thing and the technological advancement completely destroyed anything even related to that skill set. I can't think off the top of my head. Maybe if you were an operator at a paper mill, with the advent of the internet, you might lose that job. And as a machine operator at a paper mill, there may be a limited range of skills that would translate to, though I would imagine anyone who's working on a factory floor can probably translate that skill into many other factory floor jobs. So I can't think of anything right off the top of my head. Maybe whalers after the advent of electricity and bringing electric lights into the home, and you no longer needed whale oil. Maybe after the invention of kerosene in that respect, whaling as an industry, just because of technology, really took a turn for the worst. Because there was no point in taking on such an incredibly costly and dangerous endeavor if the oil wasn't worth a damn. But so the way that you could have addressed this, and he doesn't address this, he just completely breezes by it, and he doesn't return to this throughout the course of the book. That is the forgotten man in my case. In this case, that's what I'm going to describe him as. And this is a real criticism of this chapter that I think is a worthwhile and legitimate criticism of this chapter, especially because, like I said, that man does not get revisited in this book. So I will give you the free market response that is that in this case, first things first, everyone's wages are going to have increased over the course of due time. And in this case, the guy who's gotten laid off, the job he left should be a fairly well-paying job over the course of time and relative to historical labor. And as technology advances, maybe he builds his skill within that labor, and he should be in a free market, able to make a lot more money than in a more regulated market. And with that improved wages, the other thing that I suggest is that those investments that he should be making and the savings he should be having should be significantly more lucrative in the short and long terms, which means that not only is he investing more towards the principal should be gaining more interest in the growth period of his investment life. And then once he retires, which he should be able to do at a younger age, not only should he be able to retire younger, the earnings he should be getting should be significantly greater. And again, everything should be becoming naturally significantly cheaper. This is something I've talked about in my series on interference. So yeah, I will link to that in this video's description, how things will tend to, in a free market, get even in absolute terms significantly cheaper. TVs are a perfect example of this as technology improves. The other thing is that because of all of this, because of the technological advancements, the switching costs, if let's say you get laid off in your mid-30s because of a technological advancement that basically destroys your industry, now you've got to learn a new skill. Yes, not everybody can do that, but most people can, in many respects, learn in some way some new skill that allows them to at least put bread on the table until those investments can turn over and develop that skill throughout the course of the rest of their lives. Many people, I understand, will be like 55, and it'll be like 10 years from retirement, and we'll lose our job, and we'll have basically no way of ever really seeking as lucrative an employment. Because at 55, you learn things not nearly as fast as you learn at, say, 25 or, God forbid, 5. But in that scenario, in that world of the free market, those switching costs should be significantly cheaper, should be significantly lower of a hurdle to overcome. So because the cost of everything should have declined, technology should have improved, things like the delivery of education in a way like it has even in today's respect. To get a degree now in some sort of 2-year degree through the internet is significantly easier than it was, say, 20 years ago. And because of the advent of the internet and the internet skill and the internet university system, getting those 2-year degrees are a lot easier than they were, say, 20 years ago. Now, I would disagree. I might say that because of governmental interference in that market, because we don't have a free market in hardly any respect when it comes to that sort of degree work, yes, that it's entirely plausible that even in those 2-year degrees, the real cost has actually inclined in addition to the absolute cost. The other thing that you're going to see is that because people are going to be spending much more time, like I said, in that self-actualization side of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a huge part of self-actualization, even in a monetary sense, is just charitable donations. So when you have significantly more charity, you have significantly more options in a free market society for that person to seek some sort of charity. Maybe there is such a thing as a real charity case. In that case, we have charity for that. So in a much less regulated market, in a more free market society, you would see significantly more charity, and you would see significantly more voluntary contributions towards these charitable organizations, which, of course, then allows for the better distribution of that money in terms of charity. Axiomatically true because of, again, Smith's lesson, because it's a voluntary transaction rather than one by force. And as a last resort only, for the handful of people that slip through the cracks, if you will, there should not only be more money available, because in a truly free market society, you'd have a basically libertarian government. So there's a very limited range of things that they do. Maybe this is one of them, but they're not going to be spending nearly as much money on other things. And on top of that, because the tax basis that they have to draw on is much larger, the revenue in relative terms should significantly increase. And so they should have more money, not only more money to spend on these people who slip through the cracks, there should be a whole lot less of them. So maybe there is some sort of governmental, maybe there is some sort of role for government in that respect, in a very limited respect, to cover those. So I wish that would be my major criticism of that chapter, is that he doesn't mention that, and there is actually a free market response to all of that. I guess it goes beyond the scope of what he was looking to do with that chapter, but to not even kind of hint at it. I think he could have, because he's a better writer than I am a speaker, and that took me like 17 minutes, he could have probably in a paragraph or two at least paid a lip service to how the free market would resolve that, or how he would advocate resolving that. Now, the reason I've used the free market, of course, is because I expect Henry Hazlitt as a professor of the Austrian school to espouse the free market solution here rather than the governmental solution. I think that will become significantly more obvious. If it wasn't already obvious, I think that'll become significantly more obvious as we continue to read this book, which will continue with chapter 8 in our next read with Henry Hazlitt. So since I think I've gone on way too long, I've covered everything I wanted to cover. That's what we will do in our next read with Henry Hazlitt. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.